Imagine if we went back in time and gave an NFL team a cheat sheet for the draft, telling them exactly who the best players are in the position they are drafting for the first and second rounds, occasionally giving them a little nudge when it comes to free agency and who they shouldn't let go. What would those teams look like now if they were able to always play the draft perfectly? That's what I'm here to try and answer. Today we're taking a look at the Los Angeles Rams, and now I think it's fair to say that the general opinion about the Rams is that they don't do too well in the draft. When you think about teams who struggle to draft quality players, I think the Rams are one of the top 5-10 teams you think of. Now, of course, we only look at the first 2 rounds in this series, and I think later rounds is a bit unfair to judge teams on. If you draft starters in the first and second round pretty much every year, or if you do it successfully most years, I think you do okay in the draft. The later ones, every team's just taking a shot in the dark and hoping it works out. And with that in mind, I think you'll be surprised when it comes to how the Rams have done in recent years. Okay, so we start off with a non-surprise at left tackle. In 2014, with the 2nd overall pick, the Rams selected Greg Robinson. They could have had Jake Matthews. Now, the interior left guard, center right guard is still unchanged, so that's the rather unimpressive offensive line of the Rams in the interior. And now we move on to the right tackle, and in 2015, late in the second round, the Rams selected Rob Havenstein at right tackle, and that actually was the correct pick. There's only one other player that they could have had that's any good, Trent Brown of the 49ers. I think Havenstein is actually a quite good player, and this is as good as a pick they could have made in that position. So we move on to tight end, and in the second round in 2011, they selected Lance Kendrick, and they could have taken 2 different tight ends here that I think are better, Jordan Cameron or Julius Thomas. Either of those I think are better than Lance Kendrick. And there we have it, the offensive line, which really the only change there is Jake Matthews, which I think would be a drastic improvement over Greg Robinson. Right tackle, they couldn't have done much better. Tight end, Jordan Cameron or Julius Thomas instead of Lance Kendricks. Moving on to the wide receivers, and everything changes here. In 2013, with the 8th overall pick, the Rams selected Tavon Austin at wide receiver. They could have selected DeAndre Hopkins, and in 2012, with the 33rd overall pick in the second round, the Rams selected Brian Quick. And they could have had T.Y. Hilton. Now, we've looked at 2012 receivers quite a lot. There's other guys they could have had. I think T.Y. Hilton best replaces what they were expecting Brian Quick to do. And to finish off their wide receivers, Kenny Britt here in the slot, but obviously what you'd actually do is pop T.Y. Hilton in the slot and probably have one of the best receiving groups in the NFL. Now let's look at the quarterback, and the only quarterback they've selected in the first 2 rounds in the 5 years we cover. Well, there isn't one. Jared Goff would still be the starter here. Obviously, we don't talk about the 2016 draft in this. So then we move on to the running backs. And in 2012, with their 3rd and final selection in the 2nd round, they drafted Isaiah Peed at running back. And your options there instead could have been Lamar Miller or Alfred Morris. Obviously, we're going with Lamar Miller here, but that's not it. In 2015, with the 10th overall selection, the Rams, of course, selected Todd Gurley. And I am saying that's a correct pick. Sure, his sophomore season wasn't as good as maybe people were expecting, and they could have instead drafted Melvin Gordon or David Johnson, but I think the difference isn't big enough to where we can say they picked the wrong guy. I think Todd Gurley was the correct pick. Maybe David Johnson would have done slightly better on this team, as he also happens to be the best receiving back in the NFL. And I don't think with any of those running backs, Todd Gurley, Melvin Gordon, David Johnson, we would have seen a huge difference when they're still running behind this same offensive line of the Rams. So Todd Gurley was the correct pick from that year as well. Rob Havenstein was the correct pick. They did as good as they could have done in that second round, drafting the positions that they did. So we move on to the defense here, and we start with the safeties, which are unchanged. Maurice Alexander and TJ McDonald would still be the starters here. On to the linebackers. Mark Barron would still be the left outside linebacker. Now the Rams actually don't really have a right outside linebacker. Josh Forrest is pretty much the only guy on Ultimate Team to even put there, but with only 2 actual starting linebackers on the team, it makes you wonder how Wade Phillips is going to manage that 3-4 conversion. Anyway, on to the middle linebacker spot. With the 30th selection in the 2013 draft in the first round, the Rams selected Alec Ogletree at linebacker, and they could have instead had Kiko Alonso or Jamie Collins, but I'm going to say Alec Ogletree was the correct pick. We've already had Jamie Collins on a few teams, but even if we hadn't, I would still go with Alec Ogletree here. I'd definitely say he's better than Kiko Alonso anyway. And this is another pick the Rams have made where you can't argue they could have done significantly better than what they selected. Alec Ogletree, the correct pick. So we move on to the cornerbacks. And in 2012, with the 39th pick in the second round, the Rams selected Janoris Jenkins. And now this is a 2-part play because not only am I saying that that was the correct pick, I'm also going to argue, obviously this is a guy they shouldn't have let go in free agency. Now the only player they could have had instead here was Josh Norman. Now obviously Josh Norman is a very good player, but again, I'm going off that if there's not a huge difference, we stick with the one they selected, and some would even argue Janoris Jenkins is better, so Janoris Jenkins stays on the team, was the correct pick. Across from him, Tremaine Johnson, the guy they elected to keep instead of Jenkins. In 2014, with the 41st pick in the draft, the Rams selected LaMarcus Joyner, and this is another pick I'm saying was correct. Pretty much the only other guy they could have selected is Bashard Breeland from the Redskins, but I think LaMarcus Joyner as a nickel corner is pretty much the perfect fit for him there. And the Rams, for the positions they have selected, have made a lot of picks you can't argue could have been significantly better. And now to finish this team, onto the defensive line. This is obviously a point of pride for the Rams, one of the best defensive lines in the NFL. Let's see if it would look much different. So in 2011, with the 14th overall pick, the Rams selected Robert Quinn. And I'm going to say Robert Quinn was the correct pick. I believe he was Pro Football Writers Association Defensive Player of the Year. Obviously has had some injury problems. The other player they could have had is Cameron Jordan, who obviously is no slouch. But again, this is another pick where the Rams got it right. Now behind him, they'd still have William Hayes. And then at defensive tackle in 2014, with the 13th overall selection, the Rams selected Aaron Donald. There's no point even talking about this. Of course that was the correct pick. There's arguably not a better defensive tackle in the NFL, let alone in his draft class. They nailed it with Aaron Donald. Behind him, if we're talking 4-3, which we're going to have to considering the lack of linebackers, that have Ethan Westbrooks. But why Ethan Westbrooks? Well, in 2012, they selected Michael Brockers with the 14th overall selection. They could have had Mike Daniels instead, and that is the Rams' defensive line. Almost perfectly picked anyway. Michael Brockers obviously not a bad player, but Mike Daniels I think a little bit better. A bit of a cheat here at right end in a 4-3 scheme. Obviously you probably actually would swap Donald and Daniels if you did have those players. And these are the Rams if they drafted perfectly every year. Now what I've said here is that the Rams got more than half the selections they've made correct. 13 picks, 7 of them unchanged. Now, of course, this comes down to the fact that we're only talking within the position they drafted. You, of course, could make the argument that a different player in a different position would have been significantly better for the Rams, but we're not making decisions on their behalf. We look at what position they drafted, and if there's a better player in that position, they could have had him. So in that regard, they made 7 out of 13 picks correctly, which actually genuinely surprised me. I would have had the Rams up there, like I said at the start, as one of those teams that struggles to draft well. Well, apparently outside of maybe selecting different positions altogether, they're not that bad at finding talent. So this is the Rams team if they'd always drafted perfectly. Does this team challenge in the NFC West, or are they still missing a couple of positions?